really wanted to take this opportunity to talk about software localization specifically. I know that a lot of you guys are building software and products, software products. But in reality, a part of this is not only about building products, but a lot of integrations that exist today for localization, for content management systems, for documentation systems, are really based on the same principles. So the way that I prepared the presentation is kind of go over how did localization evolve for software, and then where are we today, and what are the challenges that we're facing today. And I wanted to kind of give a glimpse of what we're seeing coming in the next few years. So the biggest problem with software localization is that all the technology for software localization has really been built in the 90s when the programming languages were built. And it's the classic idea, like back then, like remember 1990 doesn't sound too far back, but we used modems back then. And the best mobile device was a Game Boy that had like 2 colors on it, right? So it's actually not an exaggeration to say that, you know, the basic architecture was built back then. And it's the idea that localization happens in resource files, right? A developer goes and in their code writes the phrases and marks them with some special tags. Sometimes they need to prepare IDs as well, not just prepare like the actual content, but choose IDs. And in many cases, the content doesn't even live in here. They need to choose an ID and then put it in another file, the ID with the phrases, right? Then these phrases end up in translation files that contain the source content and copies of those translation files to contain the translations. That's the standard way that programming languages work. That's what, when you go to python.org, Ruby, Java, Microsoft Technologies, all this is what you're going to find as a developer. You need to, if you want to do something more modern, you need to do your own research and go and find more modern platforms. But the reality is that 9 out of 10, maybe more, developers and product teams are using this kind of technology. The problem is that, again, it was built in the 90s, right? So what used to work back then doesn't mean that it's still working really well today. So as an example, take when shipping packages around the world back then, you had this idea where you put everything in the ship and then send it over and then wait for a month and get it back. It's kind of similar. Back then, we used to build softwares very, very differently, right? We used to put them on CDs, and we used to actually send them over somehow to the user with zip files and things like that. And really, like, software was released every few months, sometimes every year, right? And the idea was that you had the software installed on your desktop, right? And that meant that you're not expected to update that software very frequently. Obviously, things have changed since then, right? We're using emails and maps in the browser. When Google Maps introduced Google Maps, that was in the browser, you didn't need to download anything. It was pretty spectacular that you could do these kind of things as a service, right? So we no longer really use desktop apps as much. There's Adobe Photoshop and stuff, but even all those kind of software go in the cloud now, right? So the interesting thing is when we first built Transifex, and this was quite a long time ago, that this is the open source email I wrote about the first version, and Transfix started as an open source project. It was back in 2007. The idea, even back then, was to make it really easy for developers and translators to work together. Back then in the Fedora project, we had this problem that we had a bunch of files that lived in a bunch of repositories, and translators had a really difficult time actually finding those files and translating them. So we felt that the best thing that we could do is build a localization platform that allows developers and product teams to do their work really well and to make them actually love localization. Fast forward more than 13 years later, I don't think that we still achieved that vision. Like many of the people here, they have developers in their companies, and I'm pretty sure if you ask them, They're not going to tell you, hey, yes, of course, localization. Let me help you with that. Let me drop what I'm doing and come and help you. And it was kind of similar with other areas of development around coding, like DevOps and things like that. But that has changed as tools evolved. Developers started loving these side projects rather than just build the product of the company, right? So I think 13 years later, we still haven't achieved this vision. We're getting there. But when we did a retrospective and think, okay, how does the next 10 years look for Transifex? Where do we need to go to make localization available to every developer in the world and not have to wait until the company is like 200 people before they localize? And I think the common denominator that we found is that the biggest problem is resource files. Every single bit of innovation that we wanted to do had a bottleneck around the architecture of resource files. It's like when you build a house with bricks. You can build great houses with bricks, but then as things evolve, as technology evolves, the things that you are realizing now, you're able to build with cranes and with steel and things like that is way different. In fact, I was recently listening to a presentation by Lawrence Lessig, and he had this picture of New York. It's kind of clear where like the buildings that were built in the 80s stopped and where the skyscrapers began, where we started finding like the new technologies. So what's the problem with the existing system? Well, first and foremost, managing files is slow and cumbersome. Even if you add automation, it's not as fast as developers want. Number two, there's a lot of errors involved, especially when you have translators take the files from somewhere, from an FTP site, from wherever, and download them and translate them and put them back on. It's very error prone. And to make things worse, with Agile, you can fix errors very fast. But if you have this manual process of downloading the files, you're blocking developers from fixing things. So if there's a typo in the application, the developer might not fix it because in order to get translations done, they need to freeze development and wait for translations to come back. So it's not only error prone, but it's hard to fix errors even when you know they're there. Like I said, translation very frequently blocks releases. The vast majority of the language service providers out there are begging you not to change the files while they're working on them. So companies want to work on a phrase level, and LSPs not only cannot usually work on a phrase level, they work on a file level, but sometimes they work on a package level, like multiple files at the same time that you're not allowed to touch. Most file formats today do not have good support of context. Like, where did this phrase come from? Is it a button? Is it a heading 1 in my home page that I need to pay 3 times the attention than a small error box? Where's the screenshot? Where's the URL that this shows up? Is this a phrase that shows to my enterprise customers, or is it just an obscure phrase that never shows up? Is it a popular phrase? Do a lot of people see this phrase? There's not any kind of metadata support in the file formats. Change management is super difficult. Even if you store files in the repository, Git wasn't built to manage things on a phrase level like that. And the translation tools are not meant to be integrated into Git. Because again, if the developer changes a part of the file and you change that part of the file, there's going to be a merge conflict. And finally, like if you have dynamic content in your database, it just breaks down. And so many companies today not only have dynamic content in their database, but they piecemeal together their web app or the mobile app from different libraries together in microservices. So it really breaks down very, very fast. So you would imagine that Transfix customers might be like really big companies that are pushing the envelope, but no, even if you have like just weekly releases from a very small team in 2 languages, like resource files are really like breaking down. So it's not that it's a bad technology, it's that time has evolved and progressed, and technology has progressed, and what used to be like really, really good just is not like a good fit for most fast-moving companies. And the interesting thing is that with very fast releases, translators have an issue. Like developers are working too fast for the translators, right? Translators cannot keep up. But then even if you have 6-month release cycles, translators might want to fix things and content collaborators might want to fix things, but developers are saying, wait, well, we cannot really deploy these translations because our next release is in a month. And this is actually very present with downloadable applications and mobile apps. So it's really like trying to make the technology work with today's constants and today's environment. So what caused this issue? Well, we're 30 years later, obviously, than when these technologies have been built. And the modern web development frameworks, mobile app development frameworks are really, really different. They encourage a company to have 100 branches open at the same time. And not only 100 branches, but their app consists of many smaller apps. Just Transifex, which we have 15 developers, we have 40 different microservices. And I think the team hates it and wants to go to 60 in the next year. So not only you have multiple branches in each repository, but you have multiple repositories as well. And then a lot of these technologies are not just a single file format. You have multiple file formats. And then what about machine translation? When do you apply machine translation? Where do you apply machine translation versus your human translations versus a 3-step review process? There's really no metadata that can decide that. So this is like what pushed like localization to evolve a lot the last few years. And the first step was obviously add automation, which automation really means just sync these files like very, very frequently. It means use the same architecture, just do it faster. And it works for many companies, but it also doesn't work for many others. Like if your LSP is used to downloading files and translating offline, if you sync more frequently than they're starting their jobs, it will fail. If you ask for them for a quote, they give you a quote, they start translating, and you need to fix a problem, then you're stuck, right? So there's a lot of problems even with today's automation platforms like Transifex, right? Even the modern platforms. You have a lot of small files that LSPs are not very used to. You have very small translation jobs, which cause the issues we talked about. And then it's really hard to merge on a phrase level, again, when small changes happen here and there in the files. And from the customer side, developers are really complaining that there's just too many darn file formats. Usually companies want to encourage their developers to use multiple platforms and switch from teams to teams. That's what keeps developers excited in companies. And then if you have to learn multiple syntaxes, it's just a problem. People will make mistakes and build processes will break, and then releases will be delayed. So really, like even with automation, companies are pushing for more than what the current tools are asking. So we set out a few years ago, like a couple of years ago, to think, all right, what does the ideal software localization tech stack look like? So we went and talked to a lot of our customers, a lot of other companies that are not our customers. We went and talked with industry leaders that actually did this really well internally, like Facebook, Google, Netflix, even smaller companies that have innovated and built their own technologies like Airbnb and Square and Box. And we thought, okay, let's collect all the ideas together that if a developer built this today, how would they build it? So the question we asked in the beginning of the call was, what does the perfect localization tech stack look like for you? And we collected the following findings. By the way, I'll make like a small stop here to share. Again, feel free to interrupt me with questions, or we can just keep them at the end. I don't mind either. So what did we find? First, everybody hates having files. It's a problem and developers hate going and changing the files when you need something from them, and it just breaks everything down. Even the fact that you have multiple files, multiple copies of the same file, just because the platform doesn't support anything differently, it's a huge problem. So everybody believe that I want a more flexible way to manage my phrases. It has to be in a database. It cannot live with the code. We can cache it with the code, deploy it, but the source of truth should not be the code, because everything breaks once you have that. And the second thing around files is that not only we shouldn't have files, but we should make phrases the unit. The common denominator should be phrases. What does this mean? It means that if I have a phrase in Android and iOS, I want the translation to be the same. But I don't want the LSP to fix the translation. I want when a developer changes a phrase in one of the two platforms, I want them to know that this phrase was used somewhere else. So they actually want even English phrases to be a top-level citizen. Which brings us to the second point, which is people don't want translation from us. They want global content management. It's very different. Translation is that process where you take the files, you throw it over the wall, over the fence to the LSP, and then they take care of everything else, and then you just get it back. And yes, many localization managers are used to working like that. Many LSPs are used to working like that. But there's a reason why small companies like Transifex, SmartLink, PhraseUp, all of these have such popularities, because customers are pushing the envelope on that, and that's not good enough. Like usually what we found is a lot of customers come to a modern platform because they're dissatisfied with the LSP, not the technology that they have as a company, but the interaction with the LSP, and it's really the tooling the problem. So in the heart of this is not only about the customer having full access to the translation memory and full access to each phrase and seeing where the phrase is and being able to pull translations at all time and all these things, which means they shouldn't take the English file, apply the TM to get the translation files. The translation files are available at all times. They can download them every time they merge a branch, for example. So that's one concept. The second is they want to manage their source phrases together with their translations. They want to be able to upload screenshots on top of the source phrases so that translators know where they come from. They want to be able to say this phrase, do not translate it, and have a tool to be able to do that. And every time you send a new file, you want the same instruction for the same phrase to show up. You really don't want a new file to override the instructions you gave just because we're used to work with this translation job model. And the other thing is that they really want all their content centrally managed in a central location. So the source of truth, again, not be like the individual files or the LSP's TM. It needs to be something that the customer can manage and can sync at all times. And some of the modern companies that I talked about before that are showing the way to other companies, I guess, and to us, how things should be done, it developed exactly this, like a central content database. And my favorite quote was from a developer that really said that I love localization, but I hate it. It's just ugly, and I just wish it was easy and fun. And that struck me. Like we keep talking with our product team in Transfix all the time about how can we make this fun and easy and fluid and seamless that you cannot see the seams, right? The third thing is, again, edit the source language. And like this is included a little bit in the previous one, but I wanted to put more deliberate attention here because it's a model where us as translation specialists do not think about a lot. Companies work on the English content just like we're working on the translation content. The developer might write a phrase in the app, but then a product person might want to fix that phrase. like a lot of companies are applying A/B testing and analytics to see which phrases work better. And they might find a small error. So what happens when they find an error? They go in Jira, they open a Jira ticket, and then the developer needs to see that Jira ticket and go and fix it in the code, stop what they're doing, fix it in the code, and then they need to create a new deployment. It's just a mess. So developers really are good at writing features, but they're not good at managing the content. So if we maintain the idea that the source code is where the source content lives, you're immediately making the developer the person responsible to fix the English content. So the people that we interviewed asked us, I want our product managers and I want our English experts and I want our copywriters to be able to just go in an interface and fix the content, like I do with my CMS. If I have Drupal, I log in Drupal and I fix it. I don't need to ask someone else to go and fix it. But with developers, you have to do that, right? So this also means that people are eager to start localizing, start managing their global content really much before they're ready to localize. So they want to localize from English to English kind of before they're ready to go to multiple languages, just like they're usually eager to go from US English to UK English or Canada English, for example, or after they went to Portuguese, before going to new languages, they want to do Brazilian Portuguese, right? So it's that kind of smaller step before they actually localize, which I think is really powerful if companies could do that. The fourth one is they want to deploy content regardless of when the developers want to deploy their code. So this means managing the phrase outside of the code, but allow them to deploy them at all times. So it's especially critical for mobile apps, where even if you update your app, even if your coding team has automated everything and they publish a new version of the app, maybe the users will not have downloaded the latest version. One of our customers, Viber, has like 8 versions at the same time live or more out there because just people do not have an internet connection. Maybe they disabled automatic updates. So how do you fix a small problem in your app if you don't release a new language? Well, you cannot do that with files. You need a different system. I think with CMSs, that's less of a problem and marketing content because, again, it's hosted on the web. So the TMS can really publish the translations live, but it's a big problem with apps and databases. The other thing that developers have asked at is for a unified syntax. So, I mean, ICU is a great standard, and many companies are forced to use ICU and forced to find libraries that support ICU. But really, each programming language has its own format and its own syntax. So the companies need to go way beyond their standard scope to develop something if they want unified syntax. A great example that Brian McConnell, that used to be at Lyft, told me is that they brought like dozens, literally dozens, like 50 developers to work on improving their support and develop libraries for every programming language that they have in order to have a unified syntax. And if you have unified syntax, you're also able to go and reduce the number of file formats that you use. The other thing that came up was a lot of companies are actually adopting these platforms and integrate them really deeply into their developer stack and their, the fabric of how they build products, their developer operations and their content operations. And each company is different. And I think all the localization platforms, TMS, technology companies, I think if you ask all the CTOs and the head of products, they will tell you, we're just being asked to do too many things. Each company has different requirements. And obviously, I mean, if you have integrated something so much into your code and into how you build stuff, companies want to customize it. Like even the simplest example that I can bring here is some companies want to do pseudo localization differently. They might want to test other languages. or they might want to have multiple review steps, or they might want to cache translations differently. So the only way that really you can do this well is if you build the technology bottoms up like this. So it has to be open source so that the customers have access to the code. And it has to be truly open source where you can co-develop the technology with the community, not just open source and you're the steward and, hey, you can fork the repository and do whatever you want, but we're not going to merge the changes. And the other thing that is super important for many companies, especially medium to large ones, is they want to control how they publish the translations to their users. This is why solutions like the proxy servers that some companies out there have is just not liked by companies that are really serious about their infrastructure. You cannot rely on either an LSP or even a dedicated technology company for your website. It's too risky, and it just breaks the user experience. It's slow, and it might lead to a lot of security issues. So customers want to control this last mile of the content deployment. The other thing that came was dynamic content, that a lot of content today lives in databases, does not live in files. Even if we want it, it doesn't live in files. So customers are trying to take the content out and put it in a file and send it to the LSP, and that's not how databases work. Like, again, you will need to freeze your content and then find a way to merge that new file into your database. And this makes it even worse, obviously, with user-generated content. Like, we live in an era where we have an explosion of content, and technologies today only make it more possible to generate content very, very fast. And yeah, this will push the envelope even more in the next few years. And finally, something that is pretty new, I think, in our industry, and very, very few companies are asking it, but I think customers out there and organizations are asking for it much more than we are talking about it, is metadata. Not only context for translators, but the companies want to store metadata that will allow them to decide which LSP to use, how many review steps, should I send it to a machine translation or not? Should I send it to this machine translation that is better trained for this kind of translations? Should I use a post-MT editing workflow or a human translation or just MT? As a simple example, LinkedIn has like their documentation site, not in 100 languages, but in a couple dozen. So the problem is, okay, it's a big cost, and how do we choose what to send to MT and what not to send? It's all about the metadata. And different companies have different kinds of metadata. Some of them want to store just, developer comments that come from the developer. But in many cases, you might want context that comes from the design tool, from Sketch and Figma, into the TMS. Sometimes you want metadata around the phrase popularity. If it's a very popular phrase, I will want to manage it differently. So there's no way to do this with file formats, and there's no way to do this if you just use one of the repo translation management systems out there. If they don't support arbitrary metadata. So this is approximately how like a modern localization infrastructure should look like. And I mean, today, like, we use file formats and connectors and libraries, but these boxes here should be replaced by a single function that syncs content directly from your code, your databases, your CMSs into a central content repository. And then this can choose what kind of translation jobs should be triggered. Sometimes the translators need to work inside this repository, especially for micro translation jobs. But everything lives in there, and the source of truth is this repository, not the code. And I think the most critical part, one of the most critical parts in my opinion, is again this ability to build these tools, the customer to be able to build tools around the technology and extend the functionality very easily. This goes beyond just APIs. APIs just allow you to build wrappers around the technology or just build something that is a pre-processing and post-processing tool. I'm talking about tweaking how the technology actually works. How often do you want to sync content, which content to sync, what kind of metadata to store, etc. So that's why I said open source is super important. And today, like, I don't know, like a single platform of the well-known companies out there and the well-known providers that allow companies to actually do that really well. So these are our findings, and after we did this research and we talked with a lot of people, we decided to build something like this ourselves and make it open source and see where the community takes it. So we built something called Transifex Native, which is really all these concepts kind of together. So they are SDKs, it's internationalization libraries really that you can choose instead of the internationalization library that Python built in the 90s. And it's cloud native, and it syncs your content directly from your code in the cloud. So that's one. So this arrow from the code into the content repository goes directly without going through the file formats, the connectors, or the command line tools. It goes directly in the repository. The second is that it allows us to sync not only the actual content, but metadata around the content, like that this is a button, etc. The other thing is that it allows us to edit the English content in Transifex, and developers could actually switch and use this translated English instead of the developer English. So even if the code says welcome %user, you can change that in the global content repository into welcome %user exclamation mark, and then it goes back. And this is where another request, I didn't put it in the request from developers, is that they need really good quality control tools, because the translator can now break the translations in the build system, but they can also break English, which is until now, it was considered to be very, very stable. And finally, I think one of the most exciting things for me is that we're able to collect rich metadata around the translations, around the source content. That's the right terminology, I think. And we can allow LSPs and the companies to choose really smart workflows. And of course, once you have this, you can actually deploy translations, to Viber apps around the world directly. So you allow product managers and localization managers to choose when to deploy content, and you don't have to rely on developers at all. So there are a couple of platforms today that I know that do this. Obviously, Transifex Native is one. There's another platform called IIT Next. And I know a lot of companies, not a lot, a handful of companies actually that have built something like this. It's a different way of thinking about software localization, a very, very different way. So by no means, we are the only ones that do this. It's a different mentality, a different way of thinking about software localization. And I'm so excited to hearing more companies actually offer something like this and see where this takes us in the next few years.